Hey everyone, it's David Sirota. So here's a real serious question. Should a president of the United States be able to launch a nuclear weapon instantly without any sign-off from anybody else? It's a huge question right now, especially with President Trump threatening North Korea with fire and fury, especially with President Trump having tweeted before about the power and the strength of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. And now Democrats on Capitol Hill are proposing a piece of legislation that they say would be designed to limit the president's ability to launch a nuclear strike unless the president, any president, got a declaration of war from Congress, which of course is required in the Constitution, technically, for a president to make war. Now that's been ignored for decades, but that is what the Constitution says is required for a president to engage in an act of war, and I don't think anybody would dispute that launching a nuclear weapon is an act of war, whether defensive or offensive. That's in the Constitution. Now, I interviewed this week the author of a new book called Raven Rock, and it looks into the process by which a president can launch a nuclear weapon. And I think there's all this speculation out there that, well, maybe the generals are keeping Trump away from the nuclear button, or that the Secretary of Defense and Pentagon officials the president has to go through them in order to launch a nuclear weapon. But in fact, what the author of that book, Garrett Graff, told me is that actually the United States set up in the Cold War, and then moving forward from the Cold War, we set up a missile launch system that was designed to be as frictionless as possible, so that when the president orders a nuclear strike, at this point today, it can go from 4 minutes from his order to missiles being in the air. And this is, obviously a huge question about whether that's an appropriate kind of launch situation for any president, but certainly when you have a president who seems to be acting pretty erratically. In fact, the book recounts how during Richard Nixon's presidency, towards the tail end of it, the Secretary of Defense back then, James Schlesinger, actually told Pentagon officials to inform him and Henry Kissinger if Nixon, who was acting erratically towards the end of his presidency, if Nixon ordered a nuclear attack, they wanted to be alerted to it. I think the idea was, the insinuation was, don't necessarily listen to it, don't necessarily execute it immediately, because we want to make sure that these decisions are being made by somebody of sound mind, as opposed to somebody who is acting erratically and not of sound mind because they're under such political pressure. Fast forward 43 years, and I think a lot of people are hoping that the generals around President Trump are offering advice to him that will keep him from making an erratic, haphazard, destructive decision to launch a nuclear weapon in situations where that wouldn't be necessary. Garrett Graff told me that we are now living through one of the most dangerous periods in American history. Listen to what he said about this.
I certainly think it is the most concerning nuclear situation that we have faced, perhaps ever in the history of the U.S. presidency. And that's in part because we see threats that are more real today than we have seen in decades. And both on the North Korea front and on the Russia front. But then I think also you have in Donald Trump a president who has a history of making relatively odd comments about nuclear weapons. I mean, this is something that he has been interested in, and that he has, as a civilian, repeatedly argued for their use, decade by decade, going back all the way to the 1980s.
Now, that's a pretty scary assessment there from somebody who has looked deeply into the current situation about how to launch a nuclear weapon and what a president has to go through. So the question now on Capitol Hill, as Democrat Senator Senator Ed Markey and Democratic Representative Ted Lieu push forward their bill to say that the president can't launch unilaterally on his own at any moment a nuclear attack on anyone unless he has a declaration of war from Congress. The question will be whether that kind of bill will get bipartisan support. And Graff made a really interesting argument. He said, look, maybe perhaps back during the Cold War you could have argued that we needed the president to be able to go from ordering a nuclear strike to missiles going out of the silos in 4 minutes, but that today's threats don't really necessarily require that kind of fast ability to launch a nuclear weapon without some sort of sign-off from someone else. And again, the sign-off could come from Congress, it could come from somebody who's an ally of the president, it could come from the vice president, it could come from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it could come from the Secretary of Defense. But the question for the political system, really the question for everybody should be, do we want to vest the ability to launch a nuclear weapon with one single person without anybody else being able to sign off on that? It is a huge question, and it's a terrifying question.